The wind howling through the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains carries many secrets, but none as explosive as the one a desperate city woman dragged to the doorstep of a reclusive trapper. Silas Montgomery paid for a sturdy, plain-faced worker to share his isolated cabin, a transaction forged in ink, void of any tender illusions. He expected a loveless marriage, a quiet arrangement to ward off the soul-crushing winter silence. He never expected a woman with a haunted past, eyes full of defiance, and a secret so deadly it would drag a bloody reckoning to his very hearth. The November air in Wallace, Idaho tasted of wood smoke, cheap whiskey, and impending frost. Silas Montgomery stood on the splintered wooden boardwalk outside the stagecoach depot, looking like a rough-hewn monument to the wilderness itself. At 6'3", wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide coat, with a thick beard and a jagged, pale scar cutting a brutal path across his left cheekbone, he was a man who belonged to the high timber, not the bustling, muddy streets of a mining town. Silas pulled a crumpled, tea-stained letter from his pocket. It was from the Matrimonial Society of St. Louis, Missouri. The arrangement was explicitly clear, negotiated through 3 brief, sterile letters over the course of 6 months. Silas needed a woman to tend the cabin, salt the meat, mend the traps, and keep the fire burning while he ran his lines deep in the unforgiving wilderness. In return, she would receive shelter, safety, and a legal name. There were no promises of affection, no grand declarations of romance. Silas had buried his capacity for that kind of foolishness a decade ago, along with his younger brother in a shallow, rocky grave in the Dakotas. The heavy rattle of wood and iron announced the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. 6 exhausted horses dragged the coach through the muddy thoroughfare, coming to a groaning halt in front of the depot. Silas stepped forward, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He expected a broad-shouldered widow, someone thickened by hard work and tragedy, someone who wouldn't flinch at the sight of a skinned buck hanging from the rafters. Instead, the depot agent handed down a woman who looked like a stiff wind could snap her in half. Her name, according to the papers, was Clara Winslow. She stepped into the ankle-deep mud of the street with a quiet gasp, gripping the sides of a worn, out-of-fashion, emerald-green velvet coat. She was slender, her pale face framed by dark, chaotic curls that had escaped her traveling hat. But it wasn't her fragility that struck Silas. It was her eyes. They were a piercing, stormy gray, darting around the rough mining town with a mixture of profound terror and fierce, caged animal defiance. "You Silas Montgomery?" she asked. Her voice was steady, despite the visible trembling of her gloved hands. "I am," Silas grunted, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that hadn't been used for conversation in weeks. He looked her up and down, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "You don't look like the woman Mrs. Higgins described in the letters." "Mrs. Higgins is dead," Clara said flatly, her chin rising an inch. "I took her place. The ticket was already paid for. If you want a worker, Mr. Montgomery, I can work. If you want a society wife, you've wasted your money." Silas stared at her. The audacity of this fragile creature standing in the mud, dictating terms to a man twice her size, was baffling. He should have put her right back on the stagecoach. He should have demanded his $50 back from the agency. But the coach was already pulling away, and the snow clouds gathering over the mountain peaks warned that the passes would close within the week. "Grab your trunk," Silas said, turning on his heel. "We have a 3-hour wagon ride, and the temperature is dropping." They were married an hour later in the back room of the town magistrate's office. The ceremony took less than 4 minutes. Silas spoke his vows to the floorboards. Clara spoke hers to the dirty window. As soon as the ink was dry on the certificate, Silas loaded her single battered trunk into the back of his buckboard wagon. The journey up the mountain was agonizingly silent. The trail was treacherous, a narrow ribbon of dirt and ice winding through towering ponderosa pines. Clara sat rigidly on the wooden bench, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. She didn't complain when the wagon hit deep ruts, snapping her teeth together. She didn't weep when the cold bit through her thin velvet coat. Silas watched her out of the corner of his eye, begrudgingly impressed by her stoicism. When they finally reached the cabin, a sturdy, solitary structure built of thick logs and chinking, perched on a rocky bluff overlooking a vast, empty valley, the sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding red across the snow-capped peaks. Silas pushed the heavy oak door open and lit a kerosene lantern. The cabin was clean but austere. A large stone hearth dominated the room. There was a single bed in the corner, covered in thick furs, a heavy oak table, and a cast-iron stove. "Rules are simple," Silas said, dropping her trunk on the floorboards with a heavy thud. "I sleep on the cot by the fire. You take the bed. You don't touch my rifles, and you don't go wandering past the tree line alone. The wolves up here don't care how pretty your coat is." Clara stood in the center of the room, looking incredibly small. She unbuttoned her coat, revealing a simple, faded cotton dress. "And what are my duties? Keep the fire going. Cook what I bring home. Don't ask questions about my business." Silas turned to the door, grabbing his rifle. "I've got traps to check before dark. There's dried venison and beans in the pantry." As the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Clara alone in the oppressive silence of the mountain, Silas told himself this was purely a business arrangement. He needed a housekeeper. She needed a refuge. That was all it would ever be. He had no intention of letting the city woman thaw the ice that encased his heart. The first 3 weeks of their marriage were a brutal education in survival for Clara, and a profound test of patience for Silas. The winter hit the bitter roots with savage fury, dumping 3 feet of snow in a matter of days and plunging the world into a freezing white oblivion. Inside the cabin, a tense, awkward choreography developed. Clara, despite her fierce declarations at the depot, was hopelessly out of her depth. On her 3rd day, she burned a pot of rabbit stew so badly the cabin smelled of charred bone for a week. Silas had walked in, looked at the blackened mess, wordlessly scraped it into the snow for the coyotes, and began preparing a new meal without a single word of reproach. His silence cut Clara deeper than any shout would have, but she refused to surrender. When Silas was out checking his trap lines, a grueling, bone-chilling task that kept him away from dawn until dusk, Clara waged war on the cabin. She learned how to coax a roaring fire from damp kindling. She learned how to skin a hare, her stomach churning as she forced her trembling hands to wield Silas's hunting knife. She scrubbed the floorboards until her knuckles bled. Silas noticed. He noticed the blisters on her delicate palms. He noticed the way she bit her lip in fierce concentration when she tried to mend his heavy wool socks. He noticed that she never complained, not once, even when the wind howled like a banshee against the logs and the temperature dropped so low the water in the wash basin froze solid. The shift between them didn't happen in a grand, sweeping moment. It happened in the quiet spaces. It was late December, and the cold was a physical weight. Silas had been gone longer than usual. Clara, realizing the firewood pile inside the cabin was dangerously low, bundled herself in her velvet coat now patched and stained and stepped out into the biting gale to fetch more from the woodshed behind the cabin. The wind was a blinding physical force, whipping snow into her eyes and stealing the breath from her lungs. She gathered an armful of split oak, shivering violently, and turned to head back. That was when she heard it, a low, vibrating growl, cutting through the shriek of the wind. Clara froze. 10 yards away, emerging from the whiteout conditions, was a timber wolf. It was massive, its fur matted with ice, its yellow eyes fixed directly on her. It was starving, desperate, and Clara was standing directly between it and the scent of the salted meat hanging in the shed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She dropped the firewood. The sudden clatter made the wolf snarl, exposing long, yellowed fangs. It took a slow, calculated step forward. Clara backed up, her heel catching on a buried root. She stumbled, falling hard into the snowdrift. The wolf lunged. A deafening crack split the air. The wolf yelped, a spray of crimson painting the white snow as it was violently thrown off course, tumbling into a lifeless heap a few feet from where Clara lay. Clara gasped for air, scrambling backward as Silas materialized from the blizzard. He looked terrifying, a giant of a man covered in snow, his Winchester rifle still smoking in his hands, his eyes blazing with a wild, unrestrained fury. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides, dropping the rifle into the snow and dropping to his knees beside her. "Clara!" His voice cracked, stripped of its usual gruff detachment. His large, calloused hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her roughly against his chest. "Are you bitten?" Did it touch you? No, Clara stammered, her face pressed against the rough, cold leather of his coat. She could hear his heart hammering frantically against his ribs. No, I'm all right. You shot it. Silas didn't let go. Instead, he wrapped his arms tighter around her, shielding her shivering body from the wind. For the first time since she had arrived, Clara felt the sheer, overwhelming heat of the man. It wasn't just physical warmth. It was a fierce, protective energy that short-circuited every defensive wall she had built around herself. Silas suddenly realized what he was doing. He pulled back, his scarred face unreadable in the blowing snow, but his breathing was ragged. He stripped off his heavy buffalo coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders, the garment completely swallowing her. I told you not to go out in a whiteout, he growled, though the anger in his voice was fragile, masking something much deeper. He scooped her up into his arms effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing at all, and carried her back into the cabin. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted permanently. Silas didn't retreat to his cot immediately after dinner. Instead, he pulled a chair near the hearth where Clara was desperately trying to warm her frozen hands. Without a word, he reached out, taking her small, blistered hands in his massive ones. He produced a small tin of bear fat and pine resin salve, gently massaging it into her cracked skin. His touch was surprisingly tender, reverent even. Clara sat in stunned silence, watching the firelight dance across the jagged scar on his cheek. She realized, with a sudden, terrifying jolt to her heart, that the rough mountain man was beautiful. Why did you come out here, Clara? Silas asked quietly, his thumbs rubbing small circles into her palms. It was the first time he had asked about her life before the mountain. A woman like you doesn't volunteer for exile unless she's running from a fire. Clara looked away, the stormy gray of her eyes dimming. Sometimes the fire you're running from is worse than the freezing cold. Silas didn't press her. He merely held her hands a moment longer than necessary. The cold won't hurt you here. I won't let it. It was a promise. A vow far more real than the one they had muttered in the magistrate's office. In the weeks that followed, the transactional nature of their marriage dissolved into the wood smoke. They fell into a rhythm of shared glances, lingering touches, and quiet conversations by the firelight. Silas taught her how to shoot his lighter repeater rifle. Clara read to him from the few battered books in her trunk. The harshness of the bitterroots was entirely forgotten in the warmth of the cabin, as Silas realized the city woman he had bought to salt his meat had entirely captured his soul. But in the Wild West, a fire left burning too bright is bound to attract wolves, and not all of them walk on four legs. By late February, the worst of the deep freezes had broken, giving way to an agonizingly slow thaw that turned the lower mountain trails into treacherous rivers of mud. The rations in the cabin were dwindling. They were out of coffee, flour, and sugar. It was time for Silas to make the arduous trek down to Wallace. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in Silas's buffalo coat, watching him hitch the horses to the wagon. The air between them had grown thick with an unspoken, desperate affection. Just the night before, while Silas was sharpening his skinning knife by the fire, Clara had reached out and traced the line of his scar. Silas had caught her hand, pressing his lips to her wrist in a gesture of such raw, masculine vulnerability it had left her breathless. They were sleeping in the same bed now, though Silas maintained a rigid, gentlemanly distance, refusing to claim her completely until she told him her truth. He knew she was holding back. He could feel the shadow of her past lingering in the corners of the cabin. "I'll be back in 2 days," Silas said, pulling his hat down low over his eyes. "Keep the rifle loaded. Don't open the door for anyone. Who would come up here in this mud?" Clara smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Silas stepped onto the porch, cupping her face in his leather-gloved hand. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, fiercely protective press of his lips. "Just do as I say, Clara." The journey to Wallace took 5 hours of wrestling the wagon through thick, freezing muck. When Silas finally pulled into town, tying up in front of O'Malley's trading post and mercantile, the streets were buzzing with more activity than usual. The spring thaw always brought prospectors, drifters, and trouble. Silas stepped into the dim, sawdust-scented mercantile, handing his long list of provisions to Old Man O'Malley. As O'Malley began gathering the heavy sacks of flour and tins of coffee, Silas wandered toward the back of the store, where the cast-iron stove radiated heat. Next to the stove was a corkboard pinned with community notices, land claims, lost mules, and wanted posters. Silas cast a casual glance over the faded papers. Then, his blood turned to ice. It was a fresh poster, the ink still stark and black. Issued by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, authorized by the jurisdiction of St. Louis, Missouri. Wanted for grand larceny and embezzlement. $2,000 reward. Beneath the bold lettering was a surprisingly accurate charcoal sketch of a woman. Slender face. Stormy, intelligent eyes. Dark, chaotic curls. The name printed beneath the sketch was Clara Davenport. Wanted for the theft of $10,000 from the private safes of Mr. Josiah Caldwell, armed and highly dangerous. Known to use aliases. Silas stopped breathing. $2,000 was a staggering sum of money, enough to buy 1,000 acres of prime valley land, enough to start a war over. Josiah Caldwell was a name known even in the remote reaches of Idaho. He was a ruthless, bloodthirsty debt collector and railroad financier who crushed anyone in his path. If Clara had stolen from Caldwell, she wasn't just running from a fire, she was running from the devil himself. Fascinating face, ain't she? Silas stiffened. He turned slowly to see a man leaning against a barrel of pickled eggs. The man was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, a bowler hat resting on his knee, entirely out of place in the muddy mining town. A silver badge flashed inside his lapel. A Pinkerton. Name's Arthur Pendleton, the detective said, his voice slick and polished. I've been asking around town. Magistrate said he married a woman matching that description to a mountain trapper a few months back. Name of Silas Montgomery. Pendleton's eyes, flat and dead as river stones, locked onto Silas's scarred face. That wouldn't be you, would it, friend? Silas's mind raced. If he admitted it, Pendleton would ride up the mountain with a posse of deputies and drag Clara back to Missouri in chains. Caldwell's men would hang her, or worse, before she ever saw a judge. Silas felt a surge of possessive, violent rage coil in his gut. The woman in his cabin wasn't a master thief. She was the woman who read poetry by the fire, who cried when a baby deer died in the snow, who had single-handedly resurrected Silas's dead heart. Don't know any Clara Davenport. Silas lied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. My wife's name is Winslow. She's a widow from Chicago, thicker than a stump and meaner than a badger. Pendleton smirked, striking a match to light a thin cigar. Is that so? Well, I think I'd like to ride up to your property anyway, Mr. Montgomery. Just to pay my respects to the missus. Introduce myself. You ride up my mountain, Silas said, stepping into Pendleton's personal space, towering over the detective, and I'll assume you're a poacher. I shoot poachers on sight. Pendleton's smirk vanished. He puffed on his cigar, calculating the odds. Caldwell wants his money, Montgomery. He wants the girl to make an example of her. A man could buy a lot of peace and quiet with $2,000. Silas didn't answer. He turned, grabbed his supplies from a wide-eyed O'Malley, dropped a gold eagle coin on the counter and stormed out. He drove the horses mercilessly on the way back, the wagon fishtailing wildly in the mud. The sun had set by the time he reached the clearing, plunging the cabin into darkness. No smoke rose from the chimney. Panic seized Silas. He threw the reins down, drew his Colt revolver, and kicked the heavy oak door open. Clara! The cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to embers. Clara was standing in the center of the room, her back to the door. In her hands, she held a heavy, iron-bound lockbox that Silas kept hidden beneath the floorboards under his cot, a box where he kept his savings. The box was open, but Clara wasn't looking at Silas's money. She was staring at a thick stack of letters she had pulled from the bottom of the box. Silas recognized them instantly. They were the letters from the matrimonial agency, detailing his requirements. But resting on top of them was a letter Clara had never seen a letter from Silas to the agency, stating he specifically wanted a woman with no family, no ties, someone whose disappearance would never be investigated. It was a letter he had written in his darkest, most cynical depression, wanting a worker who couldn't leave him. Clara turned around. Her face was pale, her stormy eyes wide with betrayal and fear. At her feet rested a leather satchel she had pulled from her own trunk, a satchel that had burst open, spilling thick stacks of neatly banded United States currency across the floorboards. Caldwell's money. You didn't just want a wife, Silas, Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the dark, imposing figure of her husband, holding a drawn gun. You wanted a captive, and I walked right into your trap. The heavy silence inside the cabin was thicker than the freezing mud on the mountain trail. The only sound was the ragged, panicked breathing of the two people standing on opposite sides of the room, separated by a sea of stolen cash and a shattered illusion of safety. Silas stood frozen, his thumb resting heavily on the hammer of his Colt, .45. The barrel was pointed toward the floorboards, but the threat of violence hung in the air like cordite. He stared at the woman he had married, a woman who was not a simple thick-waisted widow from Chicago, but Clara Davenport, a fugitive with a $2,000 bounty on her head. Put the paper down, Clara, Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. Clara didn't flinch. Her stormy gray eyes, usually so guarded, were blazing with a furious, heartbroken fire. She held up the crumpled letter Silas had written to the Street Lewis Matrimonial Society. You specifically requested a woman with no family, no ties, no one who would ever come looking for her. You didn't want a wife, Silas. You wanted a dog you could lock in the yard, someone who couldn't survive if they ran away. I wanted peace, Silas roared, the sudden volume of his voice shaking the lantern glass. He holstered the revolver with a violent, snapping motion and crossed the room, kicking a stack of Caldwell's banded $100 bills out of his way. I wrote that letter a year ago. Clara, I wrote it sitting next to a fresh grave in the Dakota Territory, after mountain fever took my brother, Elias. I buried him with my own hands. I was hollowed out. I didn't want love. I didn't want affection, because everything I've ever loved the wilderness has taken from me. Yes, I wanted a worker, someone who wouldn't leave. But that was before you stepped off that stagecoach. Clara's hand trembled, the letter fluttering in her grip. She looked at the giant, scarred man, seeing the raw, unvarnished agony in his eyes. The hardened mountain trapper was bleeding his soul out onto the floorboards. And what about this? Silas demanded, gesturing wildly to the thousands of dollars scattered at her feet. Josiah Caldwell? A Pinkerton detective is down in Wallace right now, buying rounds of whiskey and asking for my head. You brought the devil's own payroll into my house. You lied to me. Clara dropped the letter, her shoulders sagging as the fight suddenly drained out of her. She sank to her knees among the scattered cash, the velvet of her coat pooling around her. It wasn't a payroll, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. It was blood money. Silas stopped pacing. The sheer devastation in her voice commanded his silence. He stepped closer, looking down at the fragile woman who had single-handedly waged war on the Bitterroot winter. My real name is Clara Davenport, she began, refusing to look away from the fire. My father, Thomas, was the chief bookkeeper for the Missouri Pacific Railroad expansion through Leadville. Caldwell was the regional financier. He was skimming from the investor funds, siphoning thousands to line his own pockets. When the federal auditors came knocking, Caldwell panicked. He altered the ledgers and pinned the embezzlement entirely on my father. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew how men like Josiah Caldwell operated. They didn't just ruin a man. They salted the earth where he stood. They arrested my father in front of our home. Clara continued, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on her cheek. He died of typhus in a territorial prison before he ever saw a judge. Caldwell took our home, our bank accounts, everything, claiming it was restitution for the stolen funds. He left my mother and me in the gutter. My mother didn't survive the winter of '88. Clara looked up at Silas, her eyes hardening into chips of gray flint. I didn't steal that money out of greed, Silas. I spent 6 months forging references to get a job as a scullery maid in Caldwell's Street Lewis mansion. I memorized the combination to his private safe in the study. I took $10,000, the exact amount he claimed my father stole. Not a penny more. It was justice, and the only way I could disappear before the Pinkertons caught my scent was to answer an ad from a mountain man who promised isolation. The truth hung between them, a heavy, brutal thing. Silas looked at the money, then at the woman. She wasn't a thief. She was a survivor, a soldier who had fought a war against an empire and won. But the empire was striking back. Without a word, Silas dropped to his knees in the freezing cabin. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands gently framing Clara's face. He wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb, his gaze piercing through her defenses. "You should have told me," he said roughly. "Would you have kept me?" she whispered, her breath hitching. "If you knew I brought a Pinkerton and a hangman's noose to your door?" "Clara," Silas said, his voice dropping to a fierce, possessive murmur. "There isn't a man, a Pinkerton, or a railroad baron on this earth that could drag you off this mountain while I have breath in my lungs. You are my wife. Before God, before the magistrate, and before the timber, the arrangement is dead. I'm choosing you." Clara gasped, a shuddering sob tearing from her throat. She threw her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in the rough wool of his shirt. Silas held her fiercely, his arms wrapping around her like a fortress of muscle and bone. The physical distance they had maintained for months shattered completely. He pressed his lips to the crown of her head, then tilted her face up, kissing her with a desperate, consuming hunger that tasted of wood smoke, tears, and a vow far more permanent than ink on paper. They knelt in the dirt and the stolen money, clinging to each other as the wind screamed outside, two broken people who had finally found their missing pieces in the dark. But Silas knew the brutal math of the frontier. The Pinkerton detective, Arthur Pendleton, was a professional. A professional wouldn't sit in a warm saloon in Wallace if he suspected a $2,000 bounty was sitting just a few hours up a mountain trail. Silas pulled back, his eyes snapping to the frosted window panes. "We have to pack. Now." The illusion of safety shattered 3 hours before dawn. They had packed frantically by the dim light of the dying fire. Silas loaded the $10,000 back into Clara's leather satchel, shoving it deep into a canvas rucksack, alongside dried meat, ammunition, and medical supplies. He handed Clara his secondary weapon, a Winchester 1873 repeater. He had taught her how to shoot, but shooting a paper target was entirely different from firing at a man. "Keep the chamber loaded, keep the hammer resting on the half-cock," Silas instructed, his hands moving with lethal, practiced efficiency as he checked the cylinder of his Colt. "If we make it to the northern pass, we can cross into the Montana territory. The jurisdiction changes. It'll buy us time." "Silas," Clara said, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold steel of the rifle. "What if they are already out there?" As if summoned by her fear, the deep, frantic barking of Silas's 2 hound dogs erupted from the woodshed. The barks turned into vicious territorial snarls, echoing through the freezing canyon. Then, a sharp, suppressed crack echoed through the trees. One dog went silent. A second shot followed. Total silence returned to the mountain. Silas's blood ran cold. He grabbed the kerosene lantern, blew out the flame, and plunged the cabin into absolute darkness. "Get on the floor," he hissed, shoving Clara down behind the thick oak table. Pendleton hadn't waited for morning. He had tracked the wagon's deep mud ruts under the moonlight, and he hadn't come alone. "Montgomery!" The voice drifted from the tree line, warped by the wind. It was Pendleton, slick and confident. "I know you're in there. I've got 3 deputized men with me, ex-cavalry boys. Names Boone, Cobb, and a tracker who doesn't much care for dogs. We have the cabin surrounded. Send the girl out with the money, and we ride away. Caldwell doesn't care about a dirt-scratching trapper. You can go back to salting your hides." Silas crouched low, peering through a small crack in the chinking between the logs. He could see nothing but the shifting shadows of the ponderosa pines and the faint blue glow of the snow melting in the moonlight. "Don't listen to him," Clara whispered, pressing her back against the table, her breathing ragged. "Caldwell never leaves loose ends. They'll kill you the second I walk out that door." "I know," Silas murmured. He calculated his odds. 4 armed men. A wooden cabin. The spring thaw, making the ground outside a treacherous sucking bog. If they stayed in the cabin, they would be burned out or starved out. They had to move. Silas' army crawled across the floorboards to the hearth. Beside the heavy stone fireplace was a heavy iron ring set into a trap door, a root cellar he used to store salted meat and potatoes to keep them from freezing solid during the deep winter. It had a secondary chute that opened up 30 yards behind the cabin, concealed by a thick thicket of dead blackberry bushes. "They're going to push in," Silas said quietly, crawling back to Clara. He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the hearth. "When I start shooting, you open that hatch and get in the cellar. Do not wait for me. You crawl to the end of the chute and wait by the blackberry bushes. Understand? I am not leaving you," Clara hissed, her grip on his hand tightening like a vice. "You're not leaving me. You're securing our exit," Silas commanded, his voice brokering no argument. "Move." Before Clara could reach the iron ring, the world exploded. A volley of heavy rifle fire ripped through the front of the cabin. Wood splintered violently, showering the dark room with deadly shrapnel. A bullet shattered the cast-iron stove, sending sparks and hot ash flying into the air. Silas didn't hesitate. He rose to one knee, leveled his Winchester at the window, and fired 3 rapid shots into the tree line toward the muzzle flashes. A man screamed in the darkness, a wet, guttural sound. One down. "Boone's hit," someone yelled outside. "Light it up," Pendleton roared. "Burn the rats out." The distinct smell of kerosene drifted through the shattered windows. A moment later, a torch was thrown onto the porch. The dry wood, sheltered from the snow all winter, caught instantly. A wall of orange flame licked up the front of the cabin, illuminating the interior with a hellish, flickering light. "Clara, the hatch!" Silas yelled over the roar of the fire. Clara grabbed the iron ring and heaved. The heavy wooden door groaned open, revealing the pitch-black, earthy drop of the root cellar. She scrambled down the wooden ladder, her velvet coat snagging on a nail, tearing a long strip of fabric. Silas fired 2 more blind shots through the door to keep the men pinned down, grabbed the canvas rucksack containing their survival gear and the money, and dove into the cellar, just as the front door was kicked off its hinges. He pulled the trapdoor shut above him, plunging them into the suffocating darkness of the dirt tunnel. Above them, heavy boots stomped across the floorboards. The heat from the burning cabin was already radiating through the ceiling. "They're gone," a gruff voice Cobb shouted from above. "Find the hatch." "They didn't vanish into thin air," Pendleton barked. "Move," Silas whispered, pushing Clara forward through the narrow, dirt-walled chute. They crawled on their hands and knees, the smell of damp earth and rotting potatoes filling their lungs. Silas could hear the men above them tearing the cabin apart, the sound of his furniture smashing, the destruction of the sanctuary he had built with his own hands. They reached the end of the chute. Silas pushed open the exterior grate, the freezing night air hitting their faces like a physical blow. They scrambled out into the mud and the snow, surrounded by the sharp, thorny embrace of the blackberry thicket. 30 yards away, the cabin was a roaring inferno, the flames licking high into the night sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. Silas watched it burn, a grim, stone-like expression settling over his scarred features. The life of the solitary mountain man was dead. The fire had taken it. "There!" a voice shouted from the side of the cabin. It was the tracker, Two Fingers Jack. He was pointing directly at the blackberry thicket, a shotgun leveled in his hands. "Run!" Silas roared, grabbing Clara's hand. They plunged into the blinding, treacherous darkness of the bitterroot timber, the icy mud sucking at their boots, as the first shotgun blast shredded the branches where they had just been standing. The hunt had begun, and the mountain would offer no mercy to either the hunter or the prey. The bitterroot timber at night was a chaotic, freezing labyrinth of towering pines, deadfall, and jagged shale. Silas dragged Clara through the absolute darkness, relying on a desperate, instinctual memory of the mountain's topography. The icy mud sucked at their boots, threatening to snap their ankles with every blind step. Behind them, the glow of their burning cabin painted the low-hanging clouds a violent, bruised purple, casting long, skeletal shadows through the forest. "Keep your head down and step exactly where I step," Silas ordered, his voice barely a breath over the howling wind. He didn't look back. If they stopped moving, the cold would kill them long before Pendleton's men did. They reached the edge of a freezing, fast-moving creek that cut through the valley floor. Without hesitating, Silas waded into the waist-deep water. Clara gasped as the glacial current hit her, the agonizing cold driving the breath from her lungs. But she understood the grim necessity. The water would wash away their scent and their tracks, blinding too, fingers Jack's hounds in his eyes. They waded upstream for a grueling half-mile, their bodies going numb. When Silas finally pulled her up the muddy embankment, Clara collapsed onto the freezing moss, her limbs trembling violently. Silas fell beside her, stripping off his heavy, waterlogged buffalo coat. He wrapped it around her shivering form, his own chest heaving as he scanned the darkness with his Colt drawn. We can't outrun a bullet," Clara chattered, her teeth clicking together. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing reality of hypothermia. "We don't have to outrun them," Silas said grimly, wiping freezing water from his scarred face. "We just have to outlast them. This is my mountain. They are trespassing." A twig snapped in the darkness to their left. It was a sound so faint the wind nearly swallowed it. But Silas's head snapped toward the noise like a predator. He pressed his hand over Clara's mouth, forcing her down flat against the frozen earth. Through the dense thicket of frosted ferns, a shadow moved. It was the tracker, Two Fingers Jack, clutching a double-barreled scattergun. He was moving with terrifying silence, sweeping the riverbank. He had anticipated the water trick. Silas unholstered his hunting knife, a massive 10-inch blade of Toledo steel. He looked at Clara, his eyes silently commanding her to stay hidden. He melted into the darkness, moving with a terrifying, fluid grace that betrayed his massive size. Clara watched, paralyzed, as Jack took another step closer to her hiding spot. He paused, his head tilting as he listened to the wind. He raised the shotgun, pointing it directly at the cluster of ferns where Clara lay. Suddenly, a massive shape dropped from the low-hanging branches of a cedar tree directly behind the tracker. Silas landed silently, wrapping one massive arm around Jack's throat in a brutal chokehold, his other hand driving the heavy steel blade upward. Jack thrashed violently, the shotgun discharging into the dirt with a deafening roar that echoed through the canyon. Silas twisted viciously, and the tracker went entirely limp, sliding into the mud. Silas stood over the body, breathing hard, the knife dripping black in the moonlight, but the shotgun blast had compromised them. "Over here, by the creek," Cobb's voice rang out from the ridge above them. "Move," Silas hissed, pulling Clara to her feet. They scrambled up the treacherous rocky incline, slipping on wet shale. Bullets began to chip the rocks around them, whining through the air like angry hornets. As they crested the ridge, Silas shoved Clara behind a massive, fallen oak tree. "Load the Winchester," he barked, checking the cylinder of his Colt. "Pendleton and Cobb are pushing up the flank." Clara's hands were nearly entirely numb, but she forced her fingers to work the lever of the 1873 rifle, chambering a heavy .44-40 cartridge. She rested the heavy octagonal barrel on the rotting bark of the oak tree, staring down the iron sights into the tree line. "Silas," she whispered, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror. "I've never shot a man." "You aren't shooting men tonight, Clara," Silas said, his eyes cold and flat. "You're shooting the wolves that came to tear out our throats." Below them, Cobb broke through the tree line, sprinting toward their position with a cavalry carbine raised. Silas stepped out from cover to draw his fire. Cobb fired blindly, the bullet grazing the shoulder of Silas's shirt, drawing a sharp hiss of pain from the mountain man. Silas leveled his Colt to return fire, but his hammer fell on an empty chamber. Cobb grinned in the moonlight, racking the bolt of his carbine, taking dead aim at Silas's chest. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger of the Winchester. The heavy rifle kicked brutally against her bruised shoulder. Down in the clearing, Cobb's chest exploded backward as the .44 caliber slug found its mark. He dropped like a stone, his rifle clattering uselessly against the rocks. Silas ducked back behind the oak tree, reloading his revolver with lightning speed. He looked at Clara, his chest heaving. She was staring at the man she had just killed, her face ashen, the smoking rifle trembling in her hands. Silas reached out, his bloody hand gripping hers tightly. "You saved my life." Clara swallowed hard, tearing her eyes away from the body to meet Silas's gaze. The stormy gray of her eyes hardened into steel. "How many left?" "Just Pendleton," Silas grunted, wincing as he pressed a hand against his bleeding shoulder. And he's the dangerous one. We need to reach Lolo Pass. Once we cross the state line into Montana, his Pinkerton badge is just a piece of tin. Let's move. The ascent to Lolo Pass was an agonizing vertical climb through thigh-deep snowdrifts. Dawn was breaking over the Bitterroots, bleeding a pale, sickly gray light across the jagged peaks. The wind had died down, leaving an oppressive, ringing silence in its wake. Clara and Silas were entirely spent. Silas was losing blood from the graze on his shoulder, his movements growing sluggish. Clara was carrying the heavy canvas rucksack with the $10,000, its weight feeling like an anchor dragging her down into the ice. They reached the summit of the pass, a narrow, treacherous shelf of rock, suspended 1,000 feet above a sheer drop into a jagged ravine. A rusted iron marker, half buried in the snow, indicated the border of the Montana Territory. Freedom was less than 50 yards away. Well now, look at the two lovebirds. The slick, mocking voice echoed off the rock walls. Clara and Silas froze. Arthur Pendleton stepped out from behind an outcropping of granite, blocking the narrow path to the border. He was immaculate, completely unbothered by the brutal elements that had nearly killed his prey. In his hands, he held a sleek, nickel-plated Schofield revolver, leveled directly at Clara's chest. "I have to admit, Montgomery." Pendleton smiled, his dead eyes fixed on the mountain man. "You put up a hell of a fight. Superintendent William Pinkerton himself is going to be thrilled when I send his telegram. But you're out of mountain, and you're out of luck. Drop the guns." Silas stood in front of Clara, shielding her with his massive body. He didn't drop his Colt. "You killed my dogs, Pendleton. You burned my home. You aren't walking off this ridge." "I am," Pendleton countered, cocking the hammer of the Schofield. "Because if you twitch, I put a bullet through the girl's heart. Then I shoot you. Then I take Caldwell's $10,000, and I collect the $2,000 bounty on her pretty little head. It's simple arithmetic. Now, drop the guns, and maybe I let you bleed out in peace." Clara looked at the precipice behind Pendleton. The drop was absolute. She looked at Silas, seeing the exhaustion and the grim calculation in his eyes. He was faster than Pendleton, but he wasn't faster than a cocked trigger already pointed at her. "He's not going to let us live, Silas," Clara whispered, stepping out slightly from behind his broad back. She unslung the heavy canvas rucksack from her shoulder. "Smart girl," Pendleton sneered. "Toss the bag over here. This is what you want, isn't it?" Clara yelled, her voice ringing clear in the freezing dawn air. "Josiah Caldwell's blood money, the money that killed my father." With a sudden, violent heave, Clara swung the heavy canvas rucksack in a wide arc. But she didn't throw it to Pendleton. She threw it over the edge of the cliff. Pendleton's eyes went wide, his polished facade shattering in an instant of sheer, greedy panic. $10,000 was a fortune beyond his wildest reckoning. Without thinking, his instinct overrode his training. He lunged toward the edge of the precipice, his gun wavering away from Clara as he desperately reached out to catch the canvas strap of the falling bag. It was the only opening Silas needed. The heavy roar of the Colt. .45 shattered the morning silence. The bullet struck Pendleton square in the chest, just as his boots hit the icy rim of the cliff. The detective's body jerked backward, suspended for a fraction of a second in the pale morning light, before gravity claimed him. He vanished over the edge without a sound, following Caldwell's stolen empire down into the crushing depths of the ravine. Silence returned to the mountain, absolute and profound. Silas lowered his smoking revolver. He turned to Clara. She was staring at the empty cliff edge, the wind whipping her dark curls around her face. She had thrown away her vengeance, her safety net, and the fortune she had risked her life to secure. Silas crossed the distance between them, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder, and pulled her roughly into his chest. Clara buried her face in his shirt, her arms wrapping around his waist with a desperate, crushing strength. "It's gone," she whispered into the rough wool. "The money is gone. Let it rot," Silas breathed, resting his chin on the top of her head, his eyes fixed on the rusted iron marker of the Montana border. "We don't need Caldwell's money to build a life. We just need a clear trail and a sharp axe." He pulled back, framing her exhausted, dirt-streaked face in his hands. The stormy gray of her eyes was no longer guarded or terrified. It was clear, shining with an unbreakable, fierce devotion. Silas leaned down and kissed her, not with the desperate, panicked hunger of the night before, but with the deep, steady promise of a man who had finally found his true north. "Come on, Mrs. Montgomery," Silas murmured against her lips. "Let's go home." Hand in hand, they stepped past the rusted iron marker, leaving the blood, the fire, and the shadows of their past buried forever in the snow of the Bitterroot Mountains. The historical records of Clara Davenport officially ceased to exist after February of 1891. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency officially listed the case as closed due to suspect mortality in a structural fire, a convenient lie to cover the embarrassing loss of 4 seasoned operatives in the Idaho wilderness. Josiah Caldwell was eventually indicted by federal marshals in 1894 for massive railroad fraud, dying penniless in a Missouri penitentiary. As for the mountain man and his bride, local legends in the Gallatin Valley of Montana speak of a towering, scarred rancher and his fiercely intelligent, dark-haired wife who built a sprawling cattle empire from nothing. They were known as Silas and Clara Winslow, entirely inseparable, commanding respect, not through violence, but through an unspoken, unyielding unity. Theirs was not a romance born of soft poetry or societal expectations. It was a love forged in the brutal crucible of the American West, a love that proved even the coldest, most isolated heart can be brought back to life when struck by the right spark.